Madam President, I rise today to speak in favor of the Rebuild America Jobs Act. I want to first just clarify for folks because it's a little confusing. We have had several proposals to create jobs that have come to the floor here in the last several weeks, and they have similar names. The one before us today is the Rebuild America Jobs Act, and it is a portion of the larger American Jobs Act that President Obama proposed and set out for the Congress to consider in September. Let me talk first about that larger bill which the President proposed. This American Jobs Act that the President proposed would have a very significant and beneficial impact on my state of New Mexico. Under that legislation, there would be payroll tax cuts for about 40,000 businesses in my state. There would be an expansion of payroll tax cuts for workers that would provide a typical New Mexico household with a median income of $44,000 with a tax cut of about $1,360 per year. There would be support for up to 2,600 construction jobs in upgrading public schools. There would be $20 million to revitalize vacant and foreclosed businesses and homes. There would be over $49 million for New Mexico community colleges. There would be unemployment insurance reforms that could help put 32,000 unemployed New Mexicans back to work. And there is funding in that legislation for up to 3,100 teachers and police officers and first responders to keep those people on the job so that they can continue to provide services to our schools, to our students, to our communities. But despite the fact that all of these important investments are fully paid for, and that is made clear in the legislation, so not a single dollar would be added to the national debt. This legislation, this comprehensive legislation, was blocked by a filibuster by our Republican colleagues a couple of weeks ago. I commend Senator Reid for continuing to fight to keep job creation on top of the legislative agenda and for bringing up parts of this broader legislation independently to see if we can get support for any of these individual parts, because each of them have a great deal of merit. 2 weeks ago, we voted on the Teachers and First Responders Back to Work Act. This would have helped states and local governments keep over 400,000 teachers and police and firefighters on the job during these tough economic times. And it was disappointing to me that this effort failed to get enough votes so that we could go ahead and consider the bill. The legislation we're discussing today would provide $50 billion in infrastructure investments in highways and transit, in rail projects across the country, and in doing so, in doing those investments, it would create thousands of jobs. Among other things, it would put Americans to work in improving 150,000 miles of roads, 4,000 miles of train tracks, restoring 150 miles of airport runways, and in implementing the next-gen air traffic modernization efforts that this Congress should be strongly supporting. Those are efforts to improve air safety and to reduce delays in air traffic. So passage of this legislation would mean at least $284 million in my home state of New Mexico in immediate infrastructure investments. And that investment of $284 million would support a minimum of 3,700 local jobs. These resources are greatly needed in my state. The Federal Highway Administration estimates that about 22% of New Mexico's major roads are in poor or mediocre condition. 19% of our bridges are structurally deficient or functionally obsolete, according to the Federal Highway Administration. In addition, the bill includes $10 billion to establish an independent national infrastructure bank in order to leverage private and public funds in advancing a broad range of infrastructure projects through loans and loan guarantees. Under this proposal, it was modeled after bipartisan legislation introduced by Senators Kerry and Hutchison earlier this year. The bank would help finance large-scale transportation and water and energy projects that are of national and regional significance. I'm glad to see that the infrastructure bank included in this bill would begin to address some of the significant challenges we have of stimulating investment in new energy projects. There's simply not enough capital available in the country to deploy these technologies at the scale that we need to deploy them to meet our national security objectives and to remain competitive in growing international markets for clean energy technologies. So the availability of this type of financing through this National Infrastructure Bank could be helpful in developing the transmission capacity required to bring renewable energies developed in my state of New Mexico to communities throughout the country. Madam President, let me also briefly comment on the fact that there is revenue raised in order to pay for this set of investments that are being proposed here. That is, there is a so-called offset for the cost of this legislation, and that's because I think all of us agree that the deficit is at unsustainable levels. We should not be committing to increased spending without finding a way to pay for it, and that's why this legislation contains a revenue-raising provision. The legislation would impose a 0.7% surtax on income exceeding $1 million. Now, what does that mean? That means that if your income is, your annual income is $1 million, does not in any way change the taxes you're required to pay. So any garden variety millionaire who only receives $1 million per year in income is not required to pay any more under this legislation. But if you exceed that and your income is $1,100,000, for example, you would have to pay an extra $700 toward the cost of this legislation. The reality is that modernizing our nation's infrastructure and stimulating job growth and enhancing policies to assist with our economic recovery does cost money. We all wish it did not, but it does. Frankly, if we are going to give more than just lip service to addressing our persistent deficits, I think it's reasonable to ask the wealthiest among us to pitch in to move America forward, to begin this, to get this economy moving again. In New Mexico, less than 0.1% of taxpayers would be impacted by this modest surtax. That means that 99.9% of New Mexicans would not be impacted at all, and the handful of filers who would be impacted would only pay the surtax on the portion of their annual income that exceeds $1 million. Madam President, I strongly believe this legislation, the Rebuild America Jobs Act, which we're going to try to proceed to tomorrow, or whenever we can get consent from our Republican colleagues to proceed to it. I believe it's important legislation. It's an important step in turning our economy around. I urge my colleagues to support it. Madam President, I yield the floor.